The 25th of October 1415 stands as one of the most memorable days in all English medieval history. It is, of course, the date where Henry V trounced the French at Agincourt in the face of overwhelming odds. Certainly, there were doubts in the English ranks as to whether they could triumph over a numerically superior French army. Such doubts were expressed to Henry V himself by one of his knights, Walter Hungerford. Henry V was not impressed by Walter's faltering confidence. He said, "Thou speakest as a fool, for by the God of heaven, in whose grace I trust, and in whom is my firm hope of victory, I would not have one more archer than I have, even if I could. Dost thou not believe that the Almighty can, through this humble little band, overcome the pride of these Frenchmen, who boast of their numbers and their strength?" Henry's blunt words in response to Walter perhaps expose a sense of bravado in Henry's demeanour before Agincourt. After all, he was no fool, and the English were heavily outnumbered, and the odds were therefore heavily against them. But a man like Henry V would not back away from the fight. It was, he felt, his God given right to become King of France, and his faith in the justness of his cause would see him triumph, even in the face of such overwhelming odds. As Henry viewed it, the French had stolen the crown that was rightfully his, following in the footsteps of Edward III, who had also made a claim to the French crown in the previous century. However, if Henry was to emerge victorious at Agincourt, he could little afford his men to waver in the same way that Walter appeared to be doing. And so, before Agincourt was fought, Henry published a letter of declaration to his soldiers, aiming to inspire them. Or perhaps inspire is the wrong word. In this proclamation, Henry speaks of the evils and barbarity of the French. He says, "But death is the least you are to suffer if you be not victorious. No, you are to expect lingering tortures and the most vile, inhumane usage from a barbarous enemy who are so cruel that your lives cannot satiate their rage." With this rather grim preamble, Henry then warns his men, his famous archers in particular, that the French had threatened to cut off the thumbs of his archers who were unfortunate enough to fall prisoner, so they could never draw a bow against the French again, although there is no record of such threats actually being made. From Henry's point of view, this was a very astute tactic. Not only was he portraying his enemy as being this grotesque monstrosity capable of absolute horrors, he was also painting them as being afraid of the renowned archers in his ranks. He was both stirring the flames of hatred in the pits of his men's stomachs, but also reminding them of their own skills. Henry then moves on to the justness of the English cause. He says, "The French usurped the dominions which belonged to the English kings in France, and that we have made war not for the proud glory of conquest or to gratify ambition, but to recover the possessions of our ancestors and our own just rights." Perhaps cleverer still was the fact that Henry made mention of great English triumphs in the past, won by Edward III and Edward the Black Prince. "I might remind you of the victories at Poitiers and Crecy. They are not only your ancient enemies whom you are to fight, but they are of the same nation whom your fathers have so often conquered." The words of Henry V do resemble those spoken by William the Conqueror before the Battle of Hastings. William had told his Normans before the battle that the English were a nation accustomed to being conquered. Agincourt, Henry told his men, was not a battle to be afraid of. This French army that now stood against them had been defeated in the past, and they shall be defeated again. It mattered little to Henry that the heady days of Crecy and Poitiers had long since passed for the English, Nor did it matter if the wars in France had changed greatly in nature through the reigns of Richard II and Henry's father, Henry IV. The great moments of victory at Crecy and Poitiers could be reawakened, Henry reckoned, and he was determined to bring about that reawakening. At home, Henry told his men, the men's families would be praying not only for their safe return, but their total victory, whilst he continued to belittle the French army, describing them as a confused crowd rather than an organised and disciplined army, whilst the French knights were cowards. The English were to fight furiously to the death, if need be, with the promises of the spoils of war emphasized by the king. France would be conquered, Henry concluded, and England shall give laws to the French. In that relatively brief letter, Henry inspired the confidence of the small number of men at his disposal. The French could be overcome, despite their numbers. The English were fighting a just cause, fighting in the same footsteps as the heroes of Crecy and Poitiers. But despite Henry's cleverly crafted and well chosen words, Agincourt could not simply be won by words. Great deeds would have to be performed, and the English would need their inspirational king to be at his very best that day. As we now know, Henry V certainly was.